We'll start in 15 seconds. Welcome to the webinar focusing today on understanding the world through sports. I'm Vlad Spencer. I'm talking to you from Washington, D.C. Our co-moderator is Anna Tadevosyan. She's in Yerevan in Armenia. The webinar is part of International Sports Programming Initiative of the State Department Sports Diplomacy Division and is produced by World Learning and Digital Communication Network Global. The idea of this virtual conversation came when, and this is an anecdote, the national team of my native country, Romania, the soccer team, lost recently to Anna's team, Armenia. And we are talking, in the context of that game, and we noticed the mental intensity of the Armenian team, and we thought that it was connected probably to a recent war that the country fought against neighboring Azerbaijan. So the related thought, from that, discussion, during that game was that while sport plays an important role globally, and we are all aware of cases of conflict resolution where sports has played a role, it also reflects through a common denominator the passion, intensity, and identity, and complex realities in countries and regions all over the world. We are honored and able today to have a panel, a prestigious panel from also all over the world, as it is the case usually with our webinars, to bring you stories that touch on important issues such as multiculturalism, integration, nationalism, conflict, separatism, geopolitical order, some positive stories, some not so positive stories, while talking, as a matter of fact, about football or cricket or basketball in a variety of regions of the world. Since we'll probably touch on issues that are sensitive without the pretense of a balanced analysis, it's important to say that statements made during the webinar reflect exclusively the individual speaker's opinion. We are not trying to look at all angles in any political story, but rather to tell stories, moments in time through the lens of sports. By now, you all know Zoom. Some of you are actually, accustomed to our webinar. We count on your questions in the chat room. Keep in mind that our goal is not only the current conversation, but mostly creating a network. So please introduce yourselves, post links. Speakers are going to do the same thing. They can contribute to the theme that we are talking about today. As you know, we built through these webinars a large network of almost 1,500 people in more than 70 countries, actually. And this proves in our mind that even during COVID, we could accomplish a lot together. When you don't talk, please mute your microphones to have a kind of a good technical flow, and hopefully everything is going to be in order. That being said, again, welcome to the webinar. Thanks a lot to the speakers that we have today. And Anna, you have the floor.
Thank you, Vlad. Thank you, and welcome to our participants and our speakers. And I will start with our first speaker from Malaysia, Haresh Deol. He's an editor at 2213. Haresh, welcome to our webinar. And now, so I want to ask following questions. So Malaysia is in the region where the next two Olympics will be held in Japan and China. If you look domestically and internationally, is sport encouraging inclusion as much as it should be, or there are still gaps and challenges?
Well, I wish we can do more, that's for sure. I think I speak on behalf of any region or any country. It's not exclusive. It's not a exclusively Malaysian problem per se, but yeah, more can be done, more should be done. And I think more importantly, what should be done is we fall back to the principles of sports, which is fair play, respect. Sometimes we say those words, but we don't practice them, whether internally or whether it across, when we cross borders. So yeah, to answer your question, I think more can be done. Gaps, there'll definitely be gaps, and yes, more can be done.
And tell us a little bit about what you do exactly, and so people will know what you do connecting sports and politics, or how it helps.
Okay, what I usually do is I write a lot about sports and annoy the politicians. I've been a journalist for the past 21 years, and I'm 21, by the way. So what I've been doing is connecting the two, as you rightfully mentioned, sports and politics. Now, what we see is many people tend to, especially in this part of the region, they tend to look at sports, purely sports. And when they talk about sports, it's very just among the elite athletes. That's a wrong definition of sports, if you ask me. Sports is actually mass first, elite second. Yeah, without participation, there wouldn't be elite athletes. So that's one way of looking at it. And because of that void in not looking at mass, we have seen in Malaysia politicians using sports as a vehicle to spread their narratives. They've used it as a tool to garner votes. Sports will always be a subject highlighted just before the elections. Promises are even made. They will promise new stadiums, for example, to secure votes before the election. So yeah, it's interlinked, and it's just inseparable. No matter how much you want to view it as, politics and sports should not mix, but in this part of the region especially, it's mixed. It's so mixed that chief ministers or the state heads are actually part of the football associations, meaning that they're either the patron or they're directly the president. And state football associations actually enjoy funds from state governments. So that's how it is.
Thank you. We'll come back to you with more questions. So I'll move to our next speaker, Dr. Muqtadar Khan. He's a professor at University of Delaware from United States. Dr. Muqtadar, welcome to our webinar. So we know that you, several years ago, you wrote an article about cricket, a mirror of global politics. We would want to know more about it and how you connected cricket with politics.
Good morning, everybody, and I'm extremely delighted to talk to you guys about sports and politics. Cricket is one of the major global sports, and it also has the same aspects that are manifest in our society, such as politics. So one of the most interesting things that has happened in the cricketing world is that it is dominated by a post-colonial country now. So India has become the dominant force in cricket, and it is because it is generating the most money. So India not only supports the international bodies that govern cricket, but it also supports various other countries. So if you want to become rich in cricket, you have to play in India or with India. So this is a reversal of the colonial model, wherein all the other sports, Europe and colonial powers continue to dominate. So you can see that this post-colonial trend of transitions of global power. For example, right now on a global scale, we see that the US, followed by China and India, are the world's biggest economies, major powers. So there is a transition of power moving away from the West towards Asian countries on a geopolitical scale. And even in the economic sphere, the whole 20th century has been how Asia is catching up with the West. But in sports, you can see that happen so clearly. People used to go to England and Australia to play cricket and to make money. Now, England and Australian players come to India to play and make money. It is Indians who used to learn English in order to be able to play in English countries. But now you have Australians learning Hindi and learning to do Punjabi dance. So you see the reversal of post-colonial politics. But what is also interesting is that India is now weaponizing cricket and using it as a weapon against Pakistan. So for the last few years, India has tried to isolate Pakistan. India doesn't play with Pakistan, even though one of the biggest sporting spectacles is an India-Pakistan match, which often attracts over 700 to 800 million viewers, which means both countries stand to make a lot of money. But India has not played Pakistan. It doesn't play any bilateral series with Pakistan, does not allow Pakistani cricketers to play in India's major tournaments, and it is demanding a change in Pakistani foreign policy and security policies before they will play with Pakistan in the sports arena. So you can see, long time ago, Nixon had used ping pong diplomacy with China in order to improve US-China relations. India is using cricket diplomacy in a coercive way. It's a coercive diplomatic initiative where it is trying to pressure political change in Pakistani behavior through cricket. I also wanted to add just one more thing before I take off, that cricket is also manifesting some of the contemporary challenges that we are facing as a result of COVID. So India is going through a second wave at the moment. Officially, they are saying 3,000 to 4,000 people are dying every day. As we speak, the unofficial estimates are between 20 to 30,000 people dying every day. And yet, until day before yesterday, India was playing cricket's most important cricket league, the IPL, which was being shown on television. People were watching this spectacle. So it was like Twilight Zone. People are dying and people are enjoying sports. So in that sense, some of the uglier side of politics is also manifest through sports. And you can see that worldwide, for example, even in the US, when Georgia passed a law on voter suppression, Major League Baseball moved the All-Star game away. So politics is as much a part of sports as it is of life.
Thank you very much. It was a good quote. And I'll move to our next speaker, Dr. Lindsay Sarah Krasnov. She's a consultant, writer, and historian from US. Welcome, Dr. Lindsay, to our webinar. And I want to ask you, we know that you wrote a book, The Making of Les Blues, where you describe not only the effort to develop sports in France, but also the connection with domestic issues and tensions. We all look at the soccer or basketball teams in France as models of integration and multiculturalism. What can you tell us about the effort that led to this and its significance?
Great, thank you, Anna, and thank you everyone to the team for bringing us together for this fascinating discussion. That's a really interesting question, and the politics of football, soccer, and of basketball in France have and still remain kind of a little bit different from each other just by nature of the sports being a little bit different. It's like comparing apples and oranges. However, the larger politics behind creation of a youth development system to kind of encourage not just sports among the masses, but also to have it feed up into a kind of ultimately into an elite sports system was really the result of the 1960 Rome Olympics, in which, this was one of the first modern Olympic summer games that was heavily mediatized on television. So you had certain new impacts and repercussions from those broadcast images, which can be very powerful, of certain national athletes winning or losing, or conversely, which nations sit at the top of the medal table. And 1960, that summer, the French Olympians did not fare as well as they had hoped or desired. There were, I think, something like 2 silver medals and 3 bronzes total, which put France around 25th place in the overall medal table, behind many countries that they felt were perhaps bigger than, or you could read into it in a variety of different ways, but it was considered a national humiliation, and it really launched a government investigation into why the French obtained this sort of result. It was the first really large government, political involvement in sport in such a fashion, and ultimately led to a series of programs trying to encourage greater youth to engage in sports at any level, and eventually led to creation of kind of a nationwide elite detection system, predominantly in football, but other sports have copied that model to various different extents, including basketball, which also today now deploys a fairly wide detection network throughout the country. And one of the things I've been working on over the past, say, 7 years has been French basketball, and the different sports diplomacy influences that play into it, getting at this question of how and why France has become one of the main international pipelines for players into the NBA and WNBA. So yeah, there's a lot of intersections of sports and politics, but also larger geopolitical forces as well in that.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll move to our last speaker with my questions, and I hope that we will have questions from our participants. Dr. Loïc Tréjers, he's from France, author and political science expert, Catholic University of Paris. Welcome, Dr. Loïc. And I want you to talk about your book that you wrote, Football in the Yugoslav Chaos. Can you please share with us some significant stories of that period and what followed?
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm showing the book here. It's only in French. I'm sorry. If some of you knows an editor that is willing to translate it in English, I will be very glad to put you in contact with my own editor. So the idea of this book that comes from my PhD was to study sport, politics, and identities in the former Yugoslavia. So in this book, you will find history of how sport, how football and football fans turned football into something that was initially used by the Yugoslav communist regime into something that was aimed at cementing Yugoslav identity above national identities, to something that was used to fuel nationalism within Yugoslavia, Croat nationalism, Serbian nationalism, and so on. And the paradox is that at the end of the 80s and beginning of the 90s, when Yugoslavia collapsed, the basketball team, the football team was the best ever. They could have won, and actually the basketball team won titles. The football team did not, but they could have won many titles. And you may remember, for those familiar with the European Championship, that in 1992, Yugoslavia was expelled from the European Championship that was due in Sweden, substituted by Denmark, which eventually won the tournament. Why? Because the country was subject of UN sanctions that included sport sanctions. It was the second time after South Africa, and they were never used again. But so it's something that is in the book because I researched that a lot based on UN archives, FIFA archives, IOC archives, because back then the Juan Antonio Samaranch did a lot so to allow Serbian athletes to go to the Olympics in Barcelona. It did not succeed for collective sports. So the basketball team did not go to Barcelona, but it succeeded for individual athletes. So it is one of the story, but the bottom line is that sports was a sphere in which you could express nationalism and in which the young countries, newly independent countries like Croatia, could implement some kind of, let's say, public diplomacy, which is not to be confused with soft power, but public diplomacy from the moment of its independence to, let's say, the half of the 2000s, when this preoccupation was a bit less important to them. But if you remember, the World Cup 1998 did a lot for its positive image back then. And if we go to nowadays, the strategy implemented by Kosovo in terms of sport diplomacy is reminiscent of what Croatia did back then, with another issue, which is that Kosovo is not recognized by the whole world. It is recognized by half of the countries in the world, which means that they have to compensate that. How do they do that? They do that in culture, they do that in digital diplomacy, and they do that in sport diplomacy. And the main success was to be granted membership in the IOC and then FIFA, UEFA. And my first success was that in Brazil in the Olympics 2016, you had Malinda Kelmendi became Olympic champion. So basically, Kosovo's flag was held. You could hear the anthem in a country that does not recognize Kosovo. So Kosovo is basically saying, we play, thus we are. You cannot say that we do not exist. Look, we are playing, we are here. This is our flag. So I think that this is a good example of how sport and politics and diplomacy can be connected.
Perfect. And the Kosovo example is the best one because UEFA recognized it and is one of the members of UEFA national associations. So by the way, we draw with them women national team, so we'll play Kosovo. So that's the best example for politics and sports. I want to ask you, all of you, tell us a story that symbolizes better the connection of sports and politics for you. So do you have stories that you can share with us? Who can start? I'm sure that Dr. Muqtadar will have lots of stories.
I would like to share a story about politics, which is very personal. Let me just start my video. When I was in 10th grade or 9th grade, I played a cricket match and my team, we went to a neighboring playground in a neighborhood to play cricket. And one of my colleagues was having a great day. He was in zone. He could do nothing wrong. He was bowling fast and he was in a great form. And he got carried away and he started taunting the opponents. But while the match was going on, the cricket matches last long. This one lasts like 5-6 hours. A lot of crowd started watching and we had about like 100 people in the audience watching us while we were winning this match in the neighborhood, and most of the crowd was from that neighborhood. And then suddenly a man came. We were all between 15 to 17 who were playing and watching, but an older man came. He was drinking alcohol while watching the match, and then he started taunting us from a religious perspective. He was talking about Muslims as people whose penises have been cut off, referring to circumcision. And he started making very strange comments. And then suddenly in the middle of the match, when it became obvious that we were going to win, he stood up, he picked up a stick and charged at us. And the entire crowd, about 100 people, charged at us. It was the most frightening moment of my life. I had never been in a public riot in India, and I was watching them. I can still imagine that moment where I saw hundreds of people charging at us with sticks. And it was very difficult because some of the people who were charging at me were good friends of mine. They were classmates from primary school. But what had happened was, I realized later that my cricket team was fully composed of Muslims. All 11 players on my team were Muslim, and all the 11 players on the other side were Hindu, and the entire audience was Hindu. So this cricket match turned into a Hindu-Muslim riot. And a lot of us got beaten up. We lost all our equipment in that riot, and we eventually police got involved, etc. But to me, it was very revealing as to how sports passions can quickly become ugly. You see that with, in Europe, there was all those soccer-related hooliganism. There were riots in Cairo related to soccer. So this tendency, we have to be very careful as we encourage our children, especially when they play sports, is that sports is not just about winning. Sports is also about fair play and recognition of the other. So celebration of diversity in sports is very, very important. There are a lot of ugly moments. There is a cricketer now who plays for England. His name is Ali. He has a long beard. And so somebody just tweeted that he's lucky that he's playing cricket for England, Otherwise, he would have joined ISIS. And now on a global stage with social media, simple comments like this from intellectuals can, incite anger and hatred. And there is a lot of anger in the world today, not just because of COVID, but social media tends to bring the worst out of people. And that is beginning to show in sports. But then there are also beautiful moments. When I came to the US, I started playing table tennis competitively. And to me, it was so fantastic because I don't know whether you have played a table tennis tournament in the US. They do not separate men and women. So my first round was against a woman, and my third round was against a man in a wheelchair who didn't have a hand. And he had taped the table tennis paddle to his hand. He didn't have fingers. He had lost them in a war at Vietnam. And he was playing, and he was older. So it was to me fantastic that the US table tennis tournament mixes genders and ages and everybody. So it brought us very close. We were not champions. This is not a national tournament. This is entertainment. So I used to drive all around Florida playing these tournaments and made so many friends from different countries, different races. And because this is the US, it used to be so funny. I would play a child in the first round, and the second round, I would play a woman who had played for Poland in the Olympics, and she trashed me, So it was amazing to see this. So sports can be a wonderful place for us, whereas as long as we are able to keep the wolves at bay and let angels thrive.
Thank you. Who else wants to tell us a story?
I'll go ahead. Taking a slightly different perspective of the football, politics, and sports equation. The last major international football competition I attended was the FIFA World Cup in France in 2019, and I'm wearing my France shirt in case you can't really tell. But for me, women's football in France and its relative growth since 2011, I mean, even before that, but really on a foot on an accelerator since 2011 has been a really interesting, fascinating story from a variety of different perspectives, along with the rise of the women's game more globally over the past decade. But being, for those who don't have the familiarity, while France is known for its World Cup winning men's team, who are still the current champions, at FIFA, they have 2 stars and are well known for their youth detection and star players such as Paul Pogba, Kylian Mbappe. For a long time, women's football in France was looked on with disdain, if it existed at all. It was long, while it actually had a very early moment of growth in the early 20th century around the First World War era. By the late 1930s, it had petered out, and under the Vichy regime had been banned. And the women's game was not really resurrected until in any larger form until the late 1960s. The French Football Federation recognized it retroactively in 1970. But even still then, it just had no esteem to it. The game was long stereotyped. Women who played were long stereotyped as being lesbians or too tomboyish. It was not considered feminine or appropriate, or a long list of other things, which perhaps gets us into a very different kind of conversation. Even in 1998 and 2000, when the men's team was at the height of international success, its women's team was, just starting to get that kind of interest. The Federation began a program to detect and try to retain and create elite female players to eventually build a side. But it was still very slow going. A major tipping point came in 2011 when the women's team did fairly well at the Women's World Cup. This was also perhaps a window of opportunity. They were able to really use the power of social media to start to engage with fans, because women's football and the national team was still at that point not really mediatized at all. And it was another unique window of opportunity because many fans or Many people in general had fallen out of love with the men's team for a whole other set of issues, which is somewhat separate from this conversation. But so that was a breakthrough. There's been significant growth since that point in time in the number of women and girls who play, growth in the types of success that the women's national team has had, pretty much since for the larger part of the past decade, they've been ranked amongst FIFA's top 5 women's sides globally, even though they still have not really won the hardware to go with it. And hosting the 2019 World Cup was seen as a major political force to help to try to drive both growth and continued growth in the women's game, a new sort of mediatization of the game, but also to really try to change perceptions, cultural perceptions and attitude towards both the game as well as who plays. And being in the stadium in Paris on opening night when France played South Korea, it was a sold out stadium. And to see the stadium packed with predominantly French spectators get solidly behind their team and sing the national anthem loudly, and to see the reaction of the team on the pitch to that was something that still marks me to this day. It was a accumulation of many long years of efforts, and while there's still a phenomenal lot of work to be done and still a lot of progress that needs to happen and to be made, you also have to judge by where they were starting from and how far they had come. A lot of the Anglophone crowds and media criticized the French for not doing enough to mediatize the game or to do enough sponsoring for it or this or the that or the that, which I think, there's some sort of valid points there. But you need to also keep in mind where the game came from and how rapid that growth has been. And changing, as we all know, changing personal and cultural attitudes is not something that happens overnight. It can be a very slow process.
Yeah, thank you. I was there in Paris in 2019 for the opening game as well. So it was amazing, sold out stadium and everybody was cheering. It was great. And I think for French women football, it's also very important, the Olympique Lyon team, they change everything in game, in general, in club, and in the vision of club, because they are the leaders and everybody now starting to following what they did since 2004. So this is a really very good story. Loic, do you have any stories to tell?
Can I quickly add something to this France soccer story? When France won the World Cup, right, recently, the men's team, Trevor Noah, a comedian in the US, made a comedic comment about how it was a team from Africa that won the World Cup for France. And it created a lot of angry responses from the French ambassador and debate. The French society does discriminate against Africans and treats them as foreigners, except when they win the World Cup for France. Then they are French and not African. So it was an interesting commentary on multiculturalism in modern Western societies.
Yeah, very true. Loic?
Here we are. I've seen a question from Brett Osler, about boycott and about softer example of highly effective activism from sportsmen. It gives me the opportunity to say that mostly sportsmen and women from the former Yugoslavia are, let's say, less in a logic of national tension rather than politicians. And it also means that they are criticized at home. I remember that during the last Olympics in Rio, you had athletes from Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia in the Olympic Village, and they were hanging out with each other, posting pictures on Instagram and everything. And at home, they were criticized for that by those saying, hey, how dare you hang it out with those traitors, with those, and the terms, the derogative terms, I will not say here, but athletes have and had, Yugoslav athletes back then, they had the experience to play with each other beyond their national identities. And when you ask the players who played for Yugoslavia in the late 80s, whether they were Serbs or Croats or Bosniaks or whatever, they would always say, notwithstanding our national feelings, first of all, we were friends. And second, we were here to do something for the good. And we would not let all what the political context pollute us with what we had to do. This is very striking when you do interview with those who were playing the 1990 World Cup. Hence the book from Gigi Riva, because there is this legend that if Yugoslavia had won this World Cup, maybe the country would have survived, which I don't believe at all, but maybe it would have survived 6 months more, or maybe it would have exploded in less bloody war, which I don't believe at all, but still. It does not mean that sportsmen cannot trigger nationalist reactions. I have plenty of examples of that, but in general, they have this experience of playing, interacting with the others, including the other ex-Yugoslav others, and they are more on the, let's say, on the good side than on the wrong side of the debate here. As for boycott, I tend to believe that either everybody boycotts or it cannot work. So it's also about the how sportsmen can empower themselves regarding competitions, because all in all, we had the Super League debate some days ago. We could hear presidents, banks, TV owners. The only one that we did not hear were players. And at the end of the day, it's about the empowerment of players themselves. How can they play 80 games a season? How can they support what they are asked to support? It's also regarding Olympics, how players, athletes are supposed to deal with the fact that the IOC will suspend them if they ever show some, display some political, I don't know, T-shirt, banner, whatever. So it raises those issues of empowerment of athletes. We are far from here. We are far from there right now.
Yeah, there's still lots of work to do in this case.
Yeah. Could I jump in really quickly and add to what Loic just said? Yeah. You know, especially what we've seen over the past year, you know, the intersection of sports and politics has taken a new twist as we've seen the greater empowerment of athletes, and they've been using their platforms to speak out for a wide variety of different issues, whether to set the record straight, to help support efforts for greater democracy, human rights efforts, social justice. And while it's that case in certain countries or certain parts of the world, that's not universal. So certainly this issue of athlete empowerment and athlete diplomacy, and when we apply it to the Olympics, is, you know, certainly a little bit different than the homegrown, more organic advocacy that we've seen over the past several years, but truly in our COVID era. And just quickly, because that does tie into what Mukhtar mentioned about the conversation about the French 2018 football team being Africa's team. You did not have high-profile footballers weighing in on that, but you did have a lot of the country's other sports people, including their elite basketball players, weighing in and trying to explain that the French concept of identity, it's not multicultural. it's a bit different, and trying to explain that they took a lot of fire on social media for that and in the press too. But a different example of athlete empowerment and how some have been wading ever more into the sports politic mix.
Yeah. Harish?
Hi. Two things. Number one, Sven, just a shout out as per what he mentioned in the chat. All I've got to say is that just keep up with your good work with the Rio Refugee Olympic team. Secondly, I just want to, on the issue of boycotts, just a different take, yeah? Malaysia boycotted the 1980 Olympics that was held in Moscow. It was because of the invasion into Afghanistan at that time. Now, there is one regret that every athlete who qualified for that games but did not take the flight to Moscow, until today, they regret that moment, the decision that was made. Why? It's because that was their only chance of competing in the biggest stage. But yet, politics took precedence and they were never able to fulfill that dream of theirs. So these athletes still today regret that moment, and they say that it was robbed from them. Two things, yeah? Now, if you want to ask about a single story with regards to sports, very quickly, I'm just going to say this. Growing up in Kuala Lumpur in the late 80s, I played football. And my team, we were all different colors, creed, and our official drink was plain water in a bucket with just a handful of cups. We all drank from the same pail. Today, or more specifically last month, there was a national school in the state of Johor in Malaysia that issued a circular. And that circular actually said that if you are of a certain race, you play a certain sport. So in a nutshell, the Malays were told to only play football. The Chinese were told that only basketball and table tennis were available to them. Now, this has actually, there was a national uproar. Ministers entered into the fray. The school principal apologized. But my conversation with a minister was that this is a result of the constant narrative played by the race-based political parties who've been in government in Malaysia all this while. And that narration seems to suggest that we will uphold the rights of certain race, but they pacify the other races by saying, don't worry, you won't be left behind. That has been drilled into the heads of, the civil service. Now, I don't know that decision by the school principal was conscious, or the decision was, unintentional, subconsciously, but the fact remains that it was done, it was said, and such a situation should not be ignored. It was isolated. It's not a reflection of Malaysians generally, but it did happen. And the problem is that we don't like to have this kind of conversations, but we need to. So yeah, I want to go back to the late 80s.
Yeah, we need to have the conversation in order to find a way to solve the issues, because this is not right. So I'll go back to Vlad.
Yeah, it's fascinating conversation, and Harish, a great point. These are necessary conversations, and actually they are made so much more understandable by talking about sports, or through the filter of sports that has the passion of so many people. And so that's the reason we are doing this webinar, and hopefully we'll continue this type of discussions. And actually the questions in the chat are an illustration of the broad interest and this ability to actually visit the world, look at the news, look at the history through the filter of something that we all love, either football, or if you want to call it soccer or basketball or cricket. It's an important way to actually teach history and talk about news at a time when there's so much disinformation and so many lies going around. So I will go through a couple of questions, and Anna is going to look at the chat. We'll go for the next probably half an hour. So I saw a question a little bit earlier from, and I apologize maybe for not pronouncing the name correctly, Chakumeka. So he started his question about, the efforts of some states, to actually cheat, using doping and everything. And actually the second part of the question was something that I could identify with easily, because I was born, by now you all know that, in Romania during communism, and this idea of state using sports victories and using all means, legal or illegal, in order to affirm, the superiority of certain ideology, of a certain, nationalistic feeling, and so forth. So if you could address a little bit this issue, when states or groups are using sports for this specific reason, and I know that Dr. Muqtadar, referred to this a little bit earlier, but maybe we could go a little bit more in depth briefly on this issue. So Dr. Muqtadar, let's start.
There is pressure on countries to perform because there is national pride associated with sports and sports performance, but cheating are of different types. For example, if you remember that when Italians discovered a new way of throwing the javelin, it was banned because the more powerful countries were then losing out on it. So legal means are often used to cheat. So for example, you have a home sport advantage. I remember that in the West, the bicycles, for example, cost more than the annual income of athletes in India. So they can't even afford to buy these expensive bicycles, forget about train on them. And in the Moscow Olympics, the Indian bicyclists all underperformed because they were given new bicycles by the country, but were never allowed to practice it. So there are different ways in which I think using heavy resources, using corporate money in sports, and using even some technology can be attributed as creating unequal playing fields. So I think that while cheating is obviously a bad thing to teach, it is culturally a bad thing, but we have to recognize that cheating happens in many, many different ways, especially because of sports betting. The sports betting industry is now bigger than $300 billion, which is the one which is visible. And if you look at the invisible betting, some people have argued that it could even reach something close to $600 billion annually in all sports. And this cheating stems as a result of betting. So in cricket, for example, a lot of cheating is triggered by people who are betting and bribing athletes to cheat. And so I think that cheating will remain a huge problem. And like society, like there are places where there is crime, and so in this sport. But it is good that people are noticing this, and it is, I suppose, the job of academics and journalists who cover their sports also to be a bit more cognizant about the cheating that takes place and highlight the fact, because there's something noble about sports, and corrupting that nobility with cheating is a crime against humanity.
Yeah, definitely. Like, so my example referred to, the former Soviet bloc and the Cold War years, and obviously, the situation in Yugoslavia, before the 90s was different in terms of, their, relation with the Soviet bloc. But still, your thoughts about this idea of, how sports was viewed during those years preceding, the conflict, and during the conflict in the region as a way to validate, either ideology, in a sense, a wrong understanding of what pride is. So any thoughts, Loic?
Well, from 1945, from the moment communist Yugoslavia emerged, the idea was to build a civic identity, Yugoslav identity, above national identities. Sport played, among other things, this role. So the priority in the system, the priority was given to collective sports and to the national team. So championships were made so that you had some big clubs in Belgrade, in Zagreb, in Split, in Sarajevo, but all of them from 14 years old, the best of them were gathered every year to play in the junior teams, okay, and to build relationship together, because the let's say the slogan, Yugoslav slogan, was brotherhood and unity. So everything was designed so that the priority would be given to the Yugoslav national team every time. The difference is that there was no such thing as a public policy of systematic doping or something like this, like we had in Eastern Germany, for instance. You had some specific sports in which Yugoslavia was very strong: water polo, handball, basketball, of course, but not that much. And there was no such thing as putting everything on women, like Eastern Germany did, because it brought a lot of medals. You didn't have that. And research showed that the closer you were to the Soviet Union, and the more medals you got back then, because you adopted their system. Yugoslavia had a different system in which identity was, let's say, building identity was seen as a more important goal than the number of medals, all in all. If you watch the palmarès, Yugoslavia doesn't have a lot of medals. They have their specialties, like basketball and water polo, because the final aim was not that, unlike Eastern Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, for instance.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, in the case of the Soviet bloc, which was, you know, obviously different from what Yugoslavia was, it was ideological identity, most of it. It is ideological identity as a bloc versus the rest, you know, the Western world. Haresh, you know, so obviously we are talking about something that, you know, is deeply rooted in history, the, you know, Cold War and you know, Soviet bloc. How does this play in your region, this idea of, you know, sports and identity? Obviously it is a region, you know, where there is a superpower, China, and you know, all the other countries. How does this kind of geopolitics based on identity, pride, ideology, and sports play in East Asia?
Oh, it plays a big role, to be honest, and we are seeing a similar crisis happening right now as we speak. It's not written as much as it should, but there is a crisis between, should Malaysia and its neighboring countries be aligned to China, or should we be aligned to US? As many of you here would already know, there's an issue with regards to the stake of some islands in South China Sea. You're seeing ships encroaching into territories. They've encroached into Malaysian waters as well. But, you know, us being Malaysians, we are rather polite. So, and there's also the fact that China is heavily investing in a lot of projects. In fact, they were heavily investing in Malaysia up until the last general election, when there was a shift in power. So it's actually a combination of a whole lot of things. And of course, you want to rely on support from US. They are, after all, the superpowers, and they've got a base in the Philippines, and, you know, Singapore, our closest neighbor, is their #1 ally. So this.
How does this play in sports? Does it have an equivalent?
Well, it does, you know, because you see the American embassy, for example, in Kuala Lumpur, organizing sporting events I think this is something that I spoke during Dr. Lindsay's class not too long ago. They would want to be seen as doing something, contributing to the society here. And then you've got China doing the same thing as well. So the way I see it, Malaysia is kind of benefiting from this. But at the same time, what happens then? You know, it's like, it's as though both countries are just ticking the bucket list, stating that, okay, we've got this allocation, we're going to do this program, we've done it, and that's it. I think there should be continuity, but to answer your question, yes, they tend to use sports. They have used sports to strengthen ties, to strengthen relationships. Has it worked? I doubt it. Because at the end of the day, it's all about dollars and cents and who's closest to us.
Yeah, definitely. Dr.
Can
Lindsay.
Vlad,
Sure,
can I quickly add one thing on race? So, for example, in the United States, race and sports politics has become very pronounced since Colin Kaepernick took the knee to highlight brutality of police treatment of Africans. It is so ironic that in 2015 onwards, he has been taking the knee to show that there is brutality against African Americans. And then we had the George Floyd episode, which actually involved a knee. George Floyd was killed when the man pressed his knee on his throat. And the conduct of President Donald Trump and the way he addressed people who take knees and asking football club owners to fire those bastards. This is exactly the phrase that President Trump did, is to exacerbate religious identity and to show that those who are taking the knee during the national anthem are anti-national and unpatriotic, when actually brutal treatment of citizens is far more unpatriotic than protesting that. So I think in the United States, you're going to see more and more athletes and more celebrities from the movies and other areas highlighting these issues, especially at this moment in the US, when white guilt is at its highest, as people tend to say, that you are going to see more and more athletes. I wish that that these protests result in legislation and policies which will eliminate racism, and we haven't reached that point yet, but at least they are contributing to how aggressively racism has pervaded sporting athletes. It impacts children at every stages, selections at high school levels, etc. There is systematic discrimination even in some of the freest countries in the world, you know, and I think that issue needs to be highlighted and discussed and exposed.
Definitely. So, Dr. Lindsay, any thoughts? You know, same question about sports and geopolitics and how it plays with this notion of identity, pride, ideology. You know, a few brief thoughts.
Well, it certainly plays into all of that, especially the identity and national pride. You know, something I talk a lot about in my sports diplomacy class is nation branding, and how that kind of fits into the mix, and how so many countries are creating formalized sports diplomacy policies to try to host sporting mega events, or to put into place the public diplomacy measures incubated through the sports lens to try to build their image as a sporting country, or one with a certain kind of prowess or influence through that level. And so, certainly that factors in, I think, pretty much, worldwide. It's not just a US or a Europe thing. You see that in many places, including, interestingly, there's some really interesting examples of African countries, particularly Rwanda and Senegal, that have been harnessing the framework of sports diplomacy ever more in their foreign policy, in their international development initiatives. And we kind of see part of that tipping off this month with the Basketball Africa League in a bubble in Kigali, the first NBA professional league outside of North America. So, certainly I think the African context is really interesting and something we haven't gone into quite as much, but I think should also be part of a larger conversation.
I think Dr. Muqtadar is right when he says Lindsay's classes must be fun. I'm sure that they are fun. Yes. You talk about some, fascinating things and things that we're all aware of, and they play into this whole idea of history and politics. I want to go to another question very quickly, and again, maybe you could fit another one before the end. So there's a question here from Andranik, I think. How do we deal with instances when sports doesn't bring people together, but rather becomes a source of friction between communities and people? And again, I'm not related this to the other specific question. There was also a question a little bit earlier about Kashmir specifically, what Dr. Muqtadar could tell us a little bit. But this idea of sports that in good circumstances and many circumstances plays a positive role, but there are some other circumstances where sports actually is viewed or is used as a tool for all types of evil intentions. So any thoughts about this? So if you could briefly tell us about this. So let's start, Lindsay. Maybe you could start.
Well, I think sports can certainly serve as a tool for a lot of positive forces, also a lot of negative forces as well. I think the key is to use it with intentionality and authenticity. And one thing that I feel obligated to say, it relates to a part of the conversation several minutes ago about cheating. I think there also needs to be a conversation in terms of, we know certain parameters of what constitutes cheating, right? Breaking certain rules that are in existence by global governance. But the idea of, what constitutes, integrity or lack thereof in sports does change a little bit, I think, from region to region, given different cultural contexts. And no, that is not saying that there should be doping or anything like that. But I think it is, something we do need to acknowledge, that there's not just one unified version of what constitutes X, Y, and Z in that world.
Yeah, and as we go to the other speakers, there's also this phenomena that we noticed lately in connection to fans, sports fans, and the way they relate to social or political issues. And you gave examples here of positive influence or impact, but they're not always like this. That means not only the hooligans. I was giving the example a little bit earlier of a party in Romania, actually, that is kind of deeply rooted into a kind of a fan club of a soccer that became, borderline extremism, in the politics of Romania. So this idea of, not only looking at the athletes, but also the fans and the context, and some influences might not be so positive within the political spectrum. So let's go to Dr. Muqtadar and see a few thoughts.
About Kashmir, unfortunately, there aren't many. Kashmir has been stifled for such a long time without the world noticing that there is no sporting activities taking place and not many athletes. The recent sportsman from Kashmir, I think, played for India, but there was no attention paid. But I do want to remind you of a soccer match that happened in 1998 between Iran and the US. And Iran actually beat the US, I think, 2-1, if I remember it correctly. But what it did was fascinating. It exposed the fact that Iranians came out respecting the US a lot, and they became fans of American athletes. And Americans were surprised that, oh my God, they're all human beings and nice people in Iran, rather than the country being demonized so much. So I think even if countries are hostile to each other, if sports are played, I think they will attract support. Recently, an Israeli tennis player was kind of excluded in a tournament in the Arab world, but later on, under international pressure, she was allowed, and she won a lot of fans in the Arab world. So what really sports can do is that it can transcend some of the ugly things that geopolitics brings to society. By you could argue that, in diplomacy, we have something called second track diplomacy. And I think sports can become a way in which those who are interested in promoting peace in society can use sports to get around. So for example, we may have trouble today trying to have a conference between, say, Iranians and the US, or Iranians and Israelis. But what if we plan to have some sporting activity? And it need not be among elite athletes also. Even in America, if Iranian doctors decide to play a soccer match against American doctors, Iranian professors, I think sports can become a way to counteract evil with just fun. I mean, the sports is such a fun activity that it can completely dilute hate.
Haresh, so same question, sports is a kind of a positive factor versus instances when sometimes it might not be.
Look, in the Malaysian context, sports is always the best way to unite Malaysians. Whenever there's any racial tension, not to say that we have any, on a large scale, but even if there are any signs, or, when politicians tend to mess things up, we always have sports to fall back on. It's been the best solution. However, yes, it has been used and abused repeatedly by those in power. To go back into the whole cooperation of politicians in sports, they use sports as a platform to launch their political career. I give you a classic example. There is a current minister in Malaysia who used sports, football specifically. He set up a football team, made sure that the football team actually played against the national team, and gained a huge following, became very savvy. He relied a lot on the fans, and that's how he won admiration, and he eventually became a youth leader, and now he's a minister. So that's a classic example of how politicians use sports to raise their profile. And sadly, the fans were used, and it's only today, after like 10 years later, we all realize, even us, oh yeah, he's used sports. And it's not exclusive to just Malaysia alone. It happens in Thailand, it happens in Singapore as well. So it's kind of a regional thing, maybe beyond the region as well.
South Asia, now cricket is a big path to political power. Prime Minister of Pakistan is one of the examples.
Yeah.
So going to Loic, there is this idea, this kind of visible fact that fans, in many Eastern European countries, do bring this negativity to a bunch of political discussion, including issues related to race. So any thoughts about this in connection to Yugoslavia, not only?
Well, in connection to Yugoslavia, what you see in the football stadiums is what I coined as a grammar of stands, which means that the wars of the 90s are used in the lexical field of football fans when they are playing a team from another nation from the former Yugoslavia. So let's say that a Bosnian team is playing against a Serbian team or a Croatian team or whatever. What you will hear and see in the banners in the stadium will always be referred to the war. So this is provocation, usual provocation, but in this context, it is related to war as a mean to provoke and as a mean to play the war by other means. What I want to say about this is that this could be dismissed as, let's say, disgusting subculture of football fans. But what they say, what they sing, what they write is not very different from the official narratives of the war, the official government narrative in Serbia, in Croatia. So basically in the stadium, when you have a tribute to a war criminal who committed suicide live on TV in Hague when the judge was telling him that he was sentenced. The guy drank poison and died. He was condemned. He was war criminal. So he had his tribute in the stadium, but also from the state itself. So the Croatian state, the president, the government paid tribute to him. Okay, so we should not forget that what you hear and see in stadiums, in the case of the former Yugoslavia, is not much different than the public narrative. And it is crucial to remind that, otherwise you miss the big picture, which is public revisionism.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I think, somebody said a little bit earlier that obviously, grassroots sports matters more. What's interesting about competitive sports that we are talking about right now is that not only looking at the players or the games itself, but to the extent that it reflects a certain public sentiment, as you said. That means, so it seems that it might be extremely negative, it might be, somewhere at the edges of the society, but nevertheless, it's important to acknowledge because it's there and it manifests itself visibly and noisily. So that's the reason, looking at these phenomena that actually, UEFA and FIFA are actually, fighting all these tendencies among fans is an important way to actually reading history through sports. And this is one of the reasons. Like you have to say.
I had a word about, yes, because it's related to UEFA and FIFA. In Croatia, you have a slogan that is a local version of Sieg Heil, okay? And you hear that in stadiums all the time when the national team plays. So at the end, it was a scandal because FARE, the organization that deals with racism in stadiums, they flagged it to UEFA and FIFA, and UEFA and FIFA forbade it to be here in stadiums. A player sang with the microphone and with the fans at the end of one game against Iceland. It was suspended from World Cup, Joe Šimunić. But the point is the debate that was triggered on this slogan in Croatia, in the political debate, the social debate about this, because you had many people who did not see any problem with that. So again, it was not something that could be reduced to, let's say, some football or fans subculture or provocative subculture. It was something bigger than that.
Yeah, definitely. So we have like 12 minutes for to continue with another question. Anna, anything?
Yeah, I think Harish wants to ask questions to our speakers, and maybe some of the participants can answer as well.
Yeah, definitely. So let's do it briefly, like 10, 12 minutes, the whole thing.
Very quickly, yeah. Number one, I think Brett asked something about what would it take from a Malay perspective to move the perception of sports diplomacy programs and initiatives to a more true relationship. One word answer would be continuity. And my question to all the panelists and also everyone who's joining in is that we grew up, or at least I grew up thinking or been told that sports is basically fair play, is basically colorblind, it's all about respect. And as such, you respect each other, you forget about your political affiliation, you forget about everything else. It's just purely sports. Now, my question would be, when athletes start making a stand and they start supporting, suddenly everyone says that, oh, it's acceptable because they are icons and they're making changes. What happens to the true principles of sports then? Isn't sports supposed to be free from any form of political affiliation? Or have we somehow evolved to consider that it's okay when athletes do it, but it's not okay when politicians use sports as a vehicle? So honestly, I'm a bit confused.
Yeah. So we'll let you answer at the end your own question. So let's go to Dr. Lindsay.
That's a really great question, Harish. Certainly when you talk about kind of at the youth or the grassroots level, it is inherent. It's supposed to be inherently apolitical, although at least in the United States, we know that's not really the case. When you look at, say, soccer, which is still predominantly a middle-class sport in terms of where there is access to it, you have to pay, and usually pay quite a lot to have access, or to continue with teams that are travel teams, you have to pay to participate. It's a pay-to-play system, and it's not just youth soccer. It's youth sports at large in this country. So I think, although I certainly remember coaches telling me it's all about fair play, and there were no actual politics in the pool or in on the pitch. There's a lot of politics certainly just around surrounding it in terms of who has access and opportunity to play it. And so I think, at least in the US, it is very mixed. That's a really great question you posed, though, and I don't think I have really quite a concrete answer for you, but definitely bears further consideration.
Let's see, Dr. Muqtada. So sports politics blind, or?
No, it is not. It is definitely not. No, it is not. It is an important element and instrument of sports. So, for example, there was this discussion of midnight basketball in order to keep African American youth engaged. Let me give you an example. In a city very nearby, white politicians built about 20 tennis courts in Black neighborhoods, and the budget was allocated as if it was trying to empower the community there. But I play there sometimes, and I find it fascinating to see that only white people traveling from the suburbs to benefit from this wonderful courts. If they really wanted to help the inner city, they would have built basketball courts rather than tennis courts. Tennis is an expensive sport. The rackets cost $200, the balls cost all the time. You could buy one basketball and many people can play with it for a long time. With tennis, you need 6, 7, 3, 9 balls at one time, and you have to keep. So it clearly excluded people with less resources and privileged those. So even small policy decisions are political, and for that we need to have a civil society which is sports sensitive. Yes, people are very sensitive in America now to various policy decisions, and civil society will immediately become alert. But we are not yet sensitized to how sports is politicized and how, in terms of allocation of funds. Like, for example, why do we have more ice rinks in universities, not other kinds of sports? Because it is catering to a certain class of students. While we are admitting students, what kind of investments is the university, for example, making in providing athletic training, etc. So there is a lot of this. You can look at the budgets as to how the resources are spent, and it is clearly catering to middle and upper middle classes. Sometimes it is racially motivated, sometimes it is class motivated. I think there is less awareness in American and other civil societies to the politicization of sports. But we must also be careful that in becoming conscious about the fact that there is politics in the sports, journalists and academics who comment on this might actually exacerbate the problem by politicizing it even more. So that is something for us to be a bit more careful about.
Definitely. Loic, any thoughts?
At least regarding competitive sport, I think it makes no doubt that sport can only be political, because competitive sport is about triggering collective emotions, is about creating togetherness, is about including against the others. So politics cannot stay aside such social considerations. So it has to be political. The issue is what you do with that, the good or the bad. But it has to be political. It is hypocrisy to say otherwise. And we see this hypocrisy in the message of the IOC, saying we should keep sport and politics aside. It is hypocrisy. And it is also a criticism that we can do to Zlatan Ibrahimovic when he told about LeBron James he should keep politics aside. I think he's wrong, especially as Ibrahimovic, as someone who comes from a region that I know a bit. Maybe he says so because he knows, first place, how mixing sport and politics ended in the former Yugoslavia. But still, it cannot not be political. The issue is what you do with that.
Zlatan himself actually was very political at a certain stage of his life. So sure. Now going to Haresh, who asked the question, I want to put a little bit of spin on the question. So you are in the region, as Anna said a little bit earlier, where Olympics will take place, hopefully, in a few weeks. So any thoughts about your own questions in relation to this big event? What are you looking for? What's your curiosity in relation to this topic, sports and politics, in looking at the upcoming Olympics?
Look, the conversation of sports and politics for the upcoming Olympics is not a conversation that anyone in Malaysia is having, to be honest. I think the conversation everyone is having right now is it safe to travel, and should we travel? That's the main priority at the moment. Also, we in this region have another issue, not so much about the Olympics, but about the coming Southeast Asia Games, where Myanmar will be competing. Now, as you already know, the junta has taken over. There's no democracy there. but yet ASEAN seems to be rather slow in taking action. So yeah, that's the conversation that's going on right now, to be honest. Not so much about Olympics, but what's going to happen at the end of the year. In fact, the reason why I asked the question earlier was because the action by a Myanmar swimmer who qualified for the Olympics, he has withdrawn from the national team, and he said that he does not want to compete because in reaction to what the military has done in Myanmar. So my question, thus the question earlier, because the national the party that was in Myanmar earlier, they had failed to address several issues as well, including the Rohingya issue and many others. Yeah. So who is right? Who is wrong?
Yeah.
I'm not. Please, sorry, I'm not in favor of any party. Yeah. Please don't get me wrong. But I'm just asking these questions because yes, I totally respect the fact of what the speakers had said earlier. But my argument or my it's still confusing, because why is it that when politicians use it, it's unacceptable, but when athletes do it, it's acceptable? It may sound naive, but it's still lingering. Sorry,
Yeah.
So I wanted to quickly add, I was in Malaysia 2.5 years ago before the COVID thing,
Yeah.
and I had a very heated argument with the Prime Minister of Perak, the Malaysian ambassador, and the Indonesian ambassadors who were there in the public setting about how tolerant Malaysia and the region was to Myanmar's near genocidal activities regarding to Rohingyas. So I'm not surprised that if they are so tolerant of genocide, why would they be upset about the de-democratization and rising authoritarianism? And that became quite a scandal, and people from the Ministry of both Malaysia and Indonesia then privately tried to reach out to me saying that behind the scenes, this is the Asian way of diplomacy. We don't confront nations publicly as Americans do. We don't like to shame each other, but behind our backs, we are working with Myanmar. And now you see the product of ASEAN's diplomacy towards Myanmar. It has got worse than better. So I think it is important for people like you and other Malaysian reporters in Indonesia and the region to really demand more from their government to stand up for human rights, etc., and ensure that no country gets away with atrocities which are so severe. In the kind of atrocities Myanmar is committing, really puts sports on the side. I mean, it should be, in my opinion, shunned by the international society until it reforms domestically.
And this,
I'm sorry, I was a bit.
Yeah, and this angle to our discussion actually proves the point that regardless of what we think about sports should be or should not be in politics, sports and politics are in reality, together, and they could be looked at, together. So, Anna?
Yeah, thank you, Vlad. And for the conclusion, I want to give the virtual floor to Ryan Murphy, Program Officer from Sport Diplomacy Division at State Department. Ryan, welcome.
Hey, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you to the panelists. It's been a great topic, and there's been a lot of different segments to this topic. So thank you all for really leading this important discussion. Obviously, sports does play a role in political decisions. Working for the U.S. Department of State, that's part of my job, and using sports as a diplomatic tool. We do try to make those events or programs continuous and help to build up more so the grassroots development of sports within countries and with countries, and also within the U.S. We specifically don't focus too much on the training of national teams or training of elite players. We leave that to the professionals. So we really do use sports as that grassroots development tool. So that's something that we focus on. But this topic has been one that obviously Vlad and I have been talking about for quite a while now, and there's a lot of great different segments that come out of this and that encompass sport and politics. So thank you all for leading that discussion and for everyone to be involved today.
Thank you, Ryan. And this discussion could have continued for hours and hours, because again, it's a discussion about our realities, about our history, and about our passion for sports. So it's definitely endless, and hopefully it will be endless. Hopefully you'll keep in touch with the panelists and with this wonderful network that we've created together. Hopefully we'll revisit the topic, maybe closer to the Olympics. In the meantime, to refer a little bit to what Harash said a little bit earlier, we all hope that the Olympics will take place. We all hope that the summer is going to bring good news in relation to COVID and the pandemic, and like sports brings people together. This pandemic unfortunately also brought people together, and there's a need to help worldwide if we want to eliminate it, to get rid of. And in relation to this case, I would like to, I'm sure that Dr. Muqtadar probably has family or relatives in India. It's a tragedy what's going on there, and it's a tragedy what's going on worldwide. So we want to express our feelings for the people of India, and in general for all those who suffer in the context of the pandemic, and hope that things are going to be better soon. I want to thank everybody for being part of this discussion. Dr. Muqtadar, Lindsay, Harash, Loic, I hope to see you again in other webinars. Obviously, my co-moderator Anna, our team at World Learning, Aaron, Laurel, Juliana, Jennifer, and Nicole. And to remind you that this webinar is part of the International Sports Programming Initiative. I'm not sure if my colleagues have that map that we are using, showing the registries. Do we have it? Yeah. Okay. So if you look at this map, you see these are in green. You see places where we have people registering for this specific webinar, and it gives you a sense of the importance of the topic, of the widespread network that the webinars have created, and passion for sports. So I want to finish with this map and thank Ryan and the Sports Diplomacy Division of the State Department, and let you know again that this was part of the Sports Programming Initiative of the Sports Diplomacy Division of the State Department, a webinar put together by World Learning and Digital Communication Network. And until next time, stay safe, stay in touch, and hope to see you soon. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you so much, Vlad, and your team.
Thank you. Thank you.